and my therapy, so to speak. We talked. Oh, were you in the green room?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Green Room. So happy Thursday. We're almost at the weekend. So we
Indeed,
have,
and I'm back from Vegas.
Vegas.
Getting over jet lag, voice coming back. It's so dry out there. It's unbelievable. Literally, if you want to talk hellish.
I'm not a fan of desert life.
You know what? If you want to talk hellish, it's 118 degrees in the afternoon. And as I've told everybody, and it's kind of a horrible perspective, but it's one that I have to share. There's way too much homelessness, of course, and mental illness involved with homelessness. And with Vegas as it is right now, if you're homeless in Vegas right now, you're literally living in hell. You know, it's hot every day, and literally with no relent, and it's just relentless. And when you don't have any money and everybody else has money and you're in squalor. So I'm glad to be back and back in the Sunshine State. We have a great guest today, and Ruth, I'm gonna let you go with it.
Today we have a wonderful journalist and communications person who has many shows and has had many shows and represents a lot of the Latinos. And I'll let you do your own bio, but we have a wonderful guest. His name is Juan Pablo Salas. So I would love to have your introduction, please, from you.
Yeah, the reason it came up, Juan Pablo, is that, with the Cuban, uprising this week and a lot. Listen, it's revolution time, and we talk about that in our green world all the time.
We do, and I'll have him introduce himself. But the reason why we did this is obviously due to the news and the local uprising, which hasn't been seen in decades. So it's interesting that this revival has come up again, Libre Cuba.
People want to be free.
Well, they do. And I mean, for me, like growing up, like when I was growing up in, the 70s and 80s, my parents came from Lithuania, which was occupied from the communists. And so I was from a young age out there with the flags waving in front of city halls, going to Washington, D.C. in an effort to free Lithuania. And we actually eventually, Lithuania did get its freedom back and the communism fell. And we were fortunate enough that we were one of the first countries that got their freedoms. But it's something it's something that's inherent, and I'm so glad that for whatever reason everything is bubbling up. But unfortunately under Castro it's still
two Castros now.
Well, it's gonna
not just Fidel, but Raul. No, seriously, how can one family continue to dominate an island? But
we have one man dominating Russia.
Yeah, well,
that doesn't cease to amaze me.
Let's get our guest.
So Juan Pablo, please give us a brief bio of yourself and a quick introduction, and then we'll hit some politics with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Juan Pablo Salas. I'm a journalist, and I am currently living in the Sarasota area, working for a company called Solmart Media. And I am of Colombian origin, living in the U.S. since '92. I'm a U.S. citizen as well. I am active politically, I am active economically, and I am part of this community. I've lived in Miami, and I am involved in the Hispanic community, and I have always been, of course, working with them. But I do believe that we all need to work together in the issues of matter. You were mentioning the situation in Cuba. It's not just Cuba, but of course, Cuba is the most important of all nowadays. The fact that finally, despite all the efforts from the regime not to let their people uprise, well, it is happening. In the end, there is no way that a people can tolerate situations like the ones they're living in. So hunger, desperation, repression, and of course, the lack of opportunities has brought the people to this point. But it's not the only country. If we look around the hemisphere, the whole hemisphere is in uprise. There are problems, and there was almost almost 2 months of national strike in Colombia. Argentina is also having issues due to the pandemic.
We don't hear much about that.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Venezuela. Goodness, Venezuela.
We don't hear much about that, Juan Pablo. And is it economically driven mostly with COVID on top of it at this point, or what's really going on down there?
There are many reasons. Of course, economy is the main reason why people is rising poverty and the lack of opportunities. But plus the pandemic, of course, has made even worse the situation in many of the countries. And this is also something that comes from all times. It's not something that is happening suddenly and just because something weird happened. No, is a continent that has been having constant and regular problems with their economy and their politics. So the instability is also part of the issue. The fact that our politics has been so polarized everywhere that is bringing people to the point where they have to fight for their own rights because their authorities and their governments are not representative enough of their need, and they don't attend and serve their needs. So eventually, people uprise, and like Colombia has been traditionally a country at war, but a situation like the one that was living during the month of May, for example, was different in comparison to any other situation before because it was a general strike. Everywhere there were blockages and people going out to protest and strikes and people manifesting their opinions. So it was different, and it is still a fluid situation. So this is something that also happened in Haiti back in January. Now Haiti lost their president, and it seems to be kind of an international case, which has complicated things and also has complicated things for Colombians around the world due to the fact that some of our nationals were involved in that situation. And now Cuba is finally joining this struggle of the peoples. People in the United States, of course, supports the people of Cuba, and everyone wants and hopes that this will give them liberation. But it's going to be tough because the communist regime is really entrenched in power, and it's going to be difficult. So they know that they have their hands full from now on, absolutely. And regarding the fact that we're in the green room, all of this has to do with the war on drugs as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Colombia, obviously, because of the cartels in Colombia, I know there was a huge stigma, but Colombia recently, the legislators voted on marijuana being legalized. I know it's quote unquote on the books, but it's not being practiced yet. But there is a big stigma, and I want to address that with the Hispanic community in general, maybe, is the idea that, well, there's a lot of history between the drug wars and the cartels of South America, whether it's Colombia or whether it's Mexico for marijuana and things like that. And there's still a stigma. And a lot of times I think the Hispanics are always fighting that stigma that, okay, well, if you're, if you're of Latin descent or if you're Hispanic, that automatically you're into drugs or you're a drug dealer or you're, something. And so are you still finding that? Because I read some articles that the younger generation seems to be breaking, but the older generation is still very shy about even addressing marijuana or anything because of the stigma of the past and of the cartels and the drug wars that were going on.
Definitely there is a difference, a generational difference. Even my generation is a little hesitant. Maybe there are more users in my generation than previous ones, but that doesn't mean that people is openly talking about that. It has changed within the last 20 years, I would say, greatly. This stigma that you referred to was very tough on us Colombians during the 80s and 90s. And during the 2000s, it was a different stigma, still related to the war on drugs, but for the fact that a lot of people was fleeing the country due to the constant war that we were living. So, yeah, there were big changes happening, especially since the new constitution in 1991, that opened up the door for more freedom and more rights for regular people. So it has been a struggle as well to gain the legalization or at least the regulation of the market regarding marijuana. You know that the cartel started with marijuana. It was a very popular staple back in the 70s, and it gave the oil necessary for that machine to begin working. Colombia has always been, because of its position geographically as a corner in the continent and its proximity to two oceans, it has always been kind of a hub for all kinds of things that travel back and forth throughout the continent. And of course, we have a long history of marauders and pirates that were staying in our territory, which created this culture of anything goes in certain areas. So it was easy for people to jump on a market opportunity, that the one that opened during the 60s and 70s with marijuana. And it created these big enterprises that later on became very industrialized. Like by the time that the Medellin cartel, for example, took control of that particular market, they became an industrialized business. And it also industrialized death, which is the other part of the equation, which was very sad. And it fueled the conflicts that were internally happening already. So it took a lot of effort.
The corruption, of course. Juan Pablo.
Of course,
with
it
money,
corrupts everything.
With money comes corruption.
Money flows everywhere, and it has the potential to corrupt anyone almost, as long as you provide them with enough money. So what happened is the culture changed within those 40 years in a way that kind of opened up the door for people to think that the government is not useful or helpful. Justice doesn't work for the regular people. Therefore, I'll do whatever I have to do in order to survive. And that kind of philosophy is still going on. And it created a big issue. Now, when the legislators try to regulate these, there is a tendency to say, okay, so let's regulate, let's open up the market so we eliminate the reasons why we are having these huge prices and these traffic problems. But the debate is very difficult, especially for Colombia, because since we have been the center of all this market for many years, if Colombia is the first country who legalizes drugs, it's going to be, again, a new pariah in the world. So that's something that plays a lot in the country. Right now, the situation is that, there is a certain individual right for people to carry and use a little portion of pot, which is trying to be regulated as well. And also, a huge market for medicinal marijuana has also opened, and it has flourished very quickly. Some companies are already producing a lot of stuff, and there is already an open door for legalized exports of these. So this combination of the opposite sides, like the good side of the product itself, and on the other side, the world that the money that comes from these kind of illegal drugs fuels, well, it's a conflict. But I think in the long run, we will be able to resolve it. When I say we, I'm not talking only about Colombians. I think the world will be able to eventually find a solution that is more appropriate than just interdiction.
I think so too, because I was reading like Uruguay is one of the countries that actually is very progressive, and I was surprised that Uruguay was. And then Mexico just now legalized, and they said their projections are they're going to take about 40 to 50% of the business of the cartels, which is huge for Mexico. And I know for Mexicans as a whole, they were anti-drug because it caused so many deaths and there were so many fights and people dying over drugs that they're hoping to resolve that.
But the plant itself, of course, doesn't cause the death. It's the governmental control, the laws, and things. And listen, just to circle back to where you were, Juan Pablo, and I couldn't help it almost, and Ruta knows it's probably my worst trait. I was going to interrupt when you were talking, but Colombian was always the king of cannabis. Back when I was, I'm, as everybody knows, just turned 65, back in the 70s and all that, it was always Colombian, Jamaican, and Mexican. So absolutely, the Colombian, cannabis was always, the top of the heap. But to me, it was absolutely the corruption, right, that was driven by the money because of the lack of understanding of the plant as the medicinal substance that it is. And, that's why I think it's so interesting throughout, South America and South American culture, of course, the Aztecs and coca leaves and, working on the fields. And, when did the chewing of a coca leaf to allow a farmer to be more productive in his fields become drug abuse from the snorting of cocaine? or from freebasing. So things of that nature. So it's always, substances always have to be looked at in light of how society is at the time. Ruta just looked up Cuba's cannabis law, and it's what, Ruta? Please tell us.
Yeah, for Cuba, it's the death penalty.
Death penalty
but,
for possession of cannabis. Come on, really?
But you know what's funny? If you look at a lot of societies, outside of Western societies, because I do international travel. If you go to Malaysia, you go into most Middle Eastern countries, it is the death penalty for a marijuana possession.
For a plant.
Because they're assuming that they all see it as a gateway drug. And even in Cuba, they're saying that their rate of violence is so low. But then again, we don't trust Cuba's numbers, but we don't, they don't report like Russia doesn't report, but their reasoning behind why it's such strict laws is because they have such strict laws on anti-cannabis and anti-any drugs. This is why their rate of violence is so low and that their rate of crime is so low. And so this is because they have such strict laws on that. And I was in, like I said, in Malaysia, and I was traveling there, and there's a big sign that says if you even have like a drop of any, whether it's alcohol or even alcohol or marijuana or any illegal drug, it can be literally a death sentence. So there are a lot more countries than we think.
Oh yeah.
But there is a counterpart to this. Not only the fact that regulation is something that comes from the top of from the government down, trying to regulate the society, but it also something that affects people even if there were no laws. The fact that it has been an illegal trade has created huge enterprises of crime. Criminality is surrounding the business itself, and it increases the price, and it also increases the problems that it generates. Like in Colombia, when you see all the different problems that are generated by the fact that there is a huge amount of people working on an illegal trade, it's a fiscal problem, it's a police problem, is a societal problem, and it is also the reason why many of the current inequalities continue to exist. At the beginning of the war, let's say back in the end of 70s, beginning of the 80s, there was a moment where a lot of people thought that the trade was sort of an equalizer in the society, because a lot of people who did not have enough income at a certain moment started to have all this income. But then it also was combined with a cultural change in which having this money was, hey, it was okay. So people started making this money. And it has a detrimental character, and it destroys the way the society behaves. So there has been also a big change in the behavior of people. I prefer to think that newer generations, younger generations, are changing the way they look at the substance itself as something that is not necessarily the source of the bad, but just a substance that needs to be learned from and regulated and worked around, but not necessarily just suppressed. And it will be a matter of time until we understand how society, our Western societies, can work with it. But in countries like Malaysia or countries of strong religious beliefs or strong political beliefs, that's going to be a different game.
I think it points to a question I wanted to ask you, Juan Pablo, just from your journalistic side and your insight, and we can bring it into the Florida political scene too, which I know we wanted to do as well, and see where we see the Hispanic community going as we go forward, because we know how important they are. But is it the young people that's driving the revolutions now still in Colombia, in Haiti, in Cuba? Is it still
Absolutely.
being driven by the young?
Even more, this period of struggle in the whole continent.
Well, they all have these, of course. They see what goes on in all parts of the world.
Yeah, the difference is they have this and they also have that. They have the cell phone, but they also have the thoughts that come with the cell phone and the attitude. The recent strike in Colombia was particularly driven by young people. Although the original calling for the strike was coming from the unions and some sectors, formal sectors of the country, like educators, it was the young people who were at the streets fighting, and they kept this, and they made a difference between their own request against the request of the formal organizations that call up for this. So even though the struggle is still there, young people has to be taken into account. That's something completely new that was not happening before. It didn't happen in my time when I was young, and it's not too bad long ago. When I was young, it was also a struggle from the youth, but it was not recognized as that. But if you look at what happened in Chile, what is happening right now in Colombia, in Haiti, and all around the world, even in South Africa nowadays, all has to do with the new spirit of the youth that has this new knowledge and this new approach to those old problems. So I'm sure they will eventually find a way to negotiate a coming out of this crisis in a better situation. Plus, it is related to other stuff like the environment. They are very environment aware. And they know that their future is going to be even more difficult than ours because they're going to have to overcome all these issues. So I think they're kind of taking their time running against time to be of influence in society. And finally, society has to kind of accept that fact and listen to the youth.
Absolutely. I know. I agree with you. I think it's always the youth. I know my husband is from Morocco, and I know that the youth in Morocco is very active and they're very political. I mean, they're educated, they're getting educated. And then the more they see, the more frustrated they become. And then, of course, the government then, though, and then we can go back a little bit to Cuba, and it's not just a regime, any regime. It's a lot of countries around the world that have, even though they may not call themselves dictators, whether they're monarchs or whether they're self-appointed leaders, the gauntlet comes down on the youth, and it's very sad. And in a lot of countries, though, still we're very fortunate here in America that people are complaining about, our internet access and our access is limited. But when you go to other countries, they shut off the internet very quickly, and they can shut the youth down very quickly. And like in the case of Cuba, they just shut all media down immediately, which is very frightening. One thing before I get back into Cuba, because I really would like to discuss Cuba, the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, they said, has a huge influence also, obviously, on the Hispanic community, and even their outlook on drugs, even on marijuana, because the Catholic Church views marijuana as a gateway drug and entry into worse drugs. So is that still playing a part with the youth, or is it again more of the older generation that's following the Catholic doctrine?
There's been a huge change also in that. When I was growing up, Colombia was an absolute Catholic country. We even had a direct agreement with the Vatican, and they were part of our legislation. It changed in '91 as part of the transformation that the country was going on. But there was also a lot of losses for the Catholic Church because of these strong positions. The concept of sin, which is at the core of the Catholic
I was raised
faith.
Catholic. It follows you the rest of your life.
Yeah, there you go. So even if there was legalization, the idea is that this is a sin because you are doing something that somehow goes against what is being written on the Bible. So this will be always a struggle. However, there is also a lot of understanding from many of the priests who are within and among the people who understand that it's not only that, it's not just a sin that controls the situation. There is also the need for these things, and there is also the inequality. So it's not easy to go black and white in these issues.
Sure.
Even within the Catholic Church, there are different views about the use of this. But of course, the doctrine will continue to be very vertical and very against sin. So they will continue to say openly that they are against all kinds of drugs, especially if you tell them that, hey, this is just for fun. That's going to be even worse. If you tell them that it's for
no fun in the Catholic Church.
No fun in the Catholic
Church.
So
it's like sex. How can you have sex for fun? That's a sin. You can only reproduce. And so the same goes on this side. So I think it will be an issue. But I also think that this is one of the issues that has brought some people out of the church. The fact that they're trying to control individual freedoms, and this had a bad effect. No, I'm looking for a word, but it has an issue. It has created a different concept in people, and
that's a disconnect.
A disconnect. There you go.
Yeah.
So what do you make of, because there's been a lot of accusations, and it's going to sort of tie into Colombia, that the Colombians were behind a lot of the propaganda for the socialism issues. Is it legit that they really were sort of pumping?
Unfortunately, Colombia right now is under the control of a party that for about 20 years has taken over, especially the war against the guerrillas, which is the Centro Democrático, which is a right-wing party led by Álvaro Uribe, who was president of Colombia for a couple of periods, and who has a strong hold on this party. And of course, it has a huge influence in government. So they decided with Donald Trump to be allies. Colombia has had a traditional non-partisan relation with the United States for the simple reason that it's a strategic country in the continent for the US. So Republicans and Democrats equally have treated Colombia with a special concern because of this. And Colombians, despite who is in power, have always have not only a special admiration for the US, but a special dependence on the US for many of the things. So what is happening right now is that somehow, because of the influence of the language of the politics during the 2020 elections and before, there was a match between what they propose as a right-wing party in Colombia and what was happening in the US. So it generated this alliance, and they decided to actively work on this. So they tested in 2016 this ideology of accusing anyone who was not from the right to be a communist or a socialist.
Wow.
And it worked. It worked.
Yeah, I'm learning
Colombia.
tons this morning.
There's a huge push from it.
Yeah, I was thinking, Juan Pablo, as you were describing Colombia with the president for a couple terms who's continuing to dominate. So was that the party that came to power right after the changes back in 91?
It took some time for them. It took some time. What happened is the war got worse by the end of the century. But in 1995, for example, was a huge, terrible trouble. So when Colombians were put in the situation of deciding if we're going to go full-fledged against the guerrillas or not, this perspective won. So it was very easy for them to say, we have to go against them and defeat them, because the US was also concerned that Colombia may fall.
And what happened is Colombia started a lot of propaganda, and especially because it's the ties of the Hispanic community. It infiltrated a lot of the Cuban population, because the Cubans are so anti-socialist and so anti-Marxist that, the ones living in Florida because of the Castro regime. And if the propaganda was going, okay, you're communist, they're communist, this is communist, the Democrats are communists in the United States, Biden's a communist, if you buy into this, it's communism. And so for the Cubans, and a lot of not just Cubans, but a lot of Hispanics,
Venezuelans, Colombians,
Venezuelans too are very anti-communist because of what's happened in Venezuela, the terrors that are there. So you have all of this influence, and you hear it from the Colombians were pushing it. And interestingly enough, like you saw the results, and in Florida, they were devastating because the Hispanic vote, especially in Miami, it went red. It went for the Trump side heavily, which it never has.
And I can't imagine how and why, but I can't imagine how and why about they're getting that kind of propaganda. Thank you so much, Juan Pablo, for the journalism. Absolutely. And seriously, the journalist that you are. Ruta knows that I speak strongly about that. I was a journalism and communications major myself as an undergrad, believe it or not. But my daddy wasn't going to let me do that because I wasn't going to make enough money. So that was the story on that. But I so respect you being out there and continuing to really bring truth, to where it needs to be to the people. And, keep doing what you do. And thank you so much for being
Thank you very much.
I know we could do another.
I want to
entire
just do
show,
one.
too.
Yeah, we
Oh,
can.
no,
I
we're
know
not-
we have to
yeah,
wrap it. I
yeah.
just want to do a quick. What is your take on Cuba now? Like on Cuba, like so. Where do you see?
My take on Cuba is it's going to be a big struggle, a long struggle, but I hope that Cuban people find a way to liberate themselves. It's been a too long regime with
It has.
very little freedoms and a lot of poverty. And I think that people need
Yes,
to
the
breathe.
lack of just
It's a
regular food.
beautiful country. It's a
Yes.
beautiful people. They have so much to give, but they can't because they don't have the resources and they don't have the freedoms for that. So I hope they can finally succeed and get some of those freedoms back.
Where can we find you, Juan Pablo? Where can we
You
listen
can-
to you and read what you do? And
Yeah, I have a blog called El Opinon, and it is at Blogspot. And I also, I'm active in Facebook, Juan Pablo Salas. And I also work here in Solmart Media, so you can listen to some of my reports in La Número Uno and La Zeta, the two radio stations that we own in this area.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Thank you very much.
Have a great
Have
day.
a great day, everybody.
too.
We'll see you next week on the Green Room.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Juan Pablo, thank you